share the screen. Yeah. Thank you, Carola. Okay, now this. Right.
Great.
Here.
Okay. So I'm assuming, is it okay for me to speak without a mask, or is it better if I keep it on? Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Fabrizio, and I'm happy that I can help inaugurate your new setup. Thank you. I really appreciate the invite, and it's always a pleasure to get to talk to people coming from a diversity of backgrounds. One thing I will mention, since a number of you in the audience are philosophers, I mentioned this to Fabrizio earlier, clearly it's sometimes difficult to talk about aesthetics and not tread all over long-standing philosophical concepts that have been debated for thousands of years. And so while in my talk, I may bring up ideas and not necessarily make reference to Kant or to Hegel or to the many other people who have used these concepts, I am aware of them to some degree. I am not myself a philosopher, but I've read some of these works and I think about these things. And so I just say that because I want you to not necessarily get the impression that those of us studying empirical aesthetics from a scientific perspective are doing so completely in a silo, ignorant of all of the mass amount of thought on this topic that has gone before. So, and of course, if you have questions about particular links like that, I welcome them, and I may not, know all of the philosophical traditions in these areas, but will of course do my best to link what I've been thinking about from an empirical cognitive neuroscience side to the more philosophical analysis of these issues. Also, if I talk too fast, let me know. I have a tendency to plan too much, so we'll see how that goes. Okay, so today, Fabrizio asked me in particular to talk about a recent study we did, and I'm going to talk about that study at the end, but I'm going to give you a bit more of an overview of a few different research projects that I've worked on. And so I don't think I need to tell this audience necessarily, but clearly humans seek out aesthetic experiences. We seek out experiences with artwork or with music. We go to operas. In addition to these cultural artifacts, we also evaluate a variety of other things in an aesthetic manner. So landscapes or faces or equations. And in fact, I think there's some really interesting questions about whether or not the brain processes that we use when approaching a cultural artifact versus a view of nature, whether or not those processes are the same, or what's different about them, what's the same about them. Can we understand some of this space of an aesthetic experience and aesthetic judgment across these different types? In particular, what I'm interested in are the psychological and neural mechanisms that support such aesthetic experiences. And so I want to offer a bit of a definition, and anytime you put out a definition, you are making yourself vulnerable because, of course, you are providing a punching bag for other people to argue with your definition. And again, that's perfectly welcome here. So I define an aesthetic experience as a perceptual experience that is evaluative, affectively absorbing, and engages sense-making or meaning processes. And often these include a strong conceptual component. And they are linked to feelings of pleasure and beauty. So that might be what we refer to as aesthetic appeal or aesthetic valuation. The feeling of being moved, and I'll come back to that concept a little bit later. The awe and the sublime. And of course, they are also linked to and can be expressed in judgments of liking or attractiveness. And I want to hopefully convey to you that one of the ways that I think about aesthetic experiences and aesthetic appeal is that it is a form of pleasure from comprehension. And that is, I think, one of the key things about aesthetic valuation, aesthetic appeal that makes it different from other types of value judgments that might be studied through the lens of neuroscience. Okay, so why would one study aesthetics from a scientific perspective? Well, clearly, aesthetic considerations affect decision-making. They affect who we spend time with, what we buy, where we want to spend our vacations. early Italy. They affect learning. I think this is very important, that actually the pleasure we get from understanding an aesthetic experience acts as a motivator. It is a part of the intrinsic motivation that pushes us to learn about the world around us from our very early days as a child right through to the expert learning that we engage in a specific domain or later in life. I also strongly believe that aesthetic considerations affect well-being. I think that all of us, in some way or another, experience that the lack of access to culture, the lack of access to nature during last year's lockdowns affected our well-being in a big way. And so I'm hopeful that these experiences can perhaps be an impetus towards more policy support around exploring how it is that aesthetics affects people's well-being and productivity. More importantly, I think that despite all of these practical considerations, aesthetic appreciation represents a fundamental way in which we interact with the world. It really represents a fundamental mode with which we analyze things around us, and it's vastly understudied from the perspective of cognitive neuroscience. Okay, so there's just a few more kind of definitional things I want to get out there on the table. So I think that the psychology and neuroscience of aesthetics, as opposed to, for example, philosophical aesthetics, should focus, or in my own work, I tend to focus on understanding the cognitive and mental processes and representations that support aesthetic experiences. And then, of course, I'm also interested in how this understanding can then support well-being or improve learning. On the other hand, there are some things I don't think that the psychology and neuroscience of aesthetics can hope to do. For example, I don't think we can use brain imaging to figure out what is beautiful, and I don't think that we can use brain imaging to figure out what is art. I think that it is important for any domain to acknowledge that there are questions that are outside what it can possibly answer. And so I am interested in understanding the psychological and mental processes that support these behaviors. Okay? Okay, so the question that I want to focus on, that I kind of, in particular in response to Fabrizio's prompts that I want to pose to you today, is the question of whether or not aesthetic appeal is an objective property of a stimulus. Is it something out there that is in the world, or is it a subjective feeling? Is it completely inside? Is it something completely inside? And I, obviously these are to some degree a bit of straw man, and I will hopefully convince you that the answer is that it's somewhere in between. In fact, that it is an interaction between these two poles. And so I'm going to walk you through a number of experiments, lines of experimentation that hopefully will show you my thinking on this and what empirical evidence I think we have for what I'm calling an interactionist account. Literally talking about the interaction between, almost in the statistical sense, between the items, the artworks or images that a person might evaluate, the people that might evaluate them, and then the statistical interaction term, that you can only predict specific responses to specific artworks when you know something about both the image and something about the person and about their interaction. Okay, so in the first part, I'm going to talk about some projects where I measure shared taste. Too much. Okay. So I'll first go through some work where we talk about, I introduce to you the methods that I use for measuring shared taste and what we think we can learn from it. Then I will walk you through a few brain imaging experiments where we focus on art and the default mode network's role in aesthetic experiences with artwork. And then third, I'll talk about this recent experiment where we specifically investigate how it is that the brain goes from a representation of what we see, visual or perceptual properties, to what we like. If I have time, I might address a newer experiment on self-relevance, but I anticipate I may not have time. We'll see. So we'll see how we do. Okay, measuring shared taste. So if I show you two images like these and ask you who of you likes the image on the left and who of you likes the image on the right more, maybe not everyone, but I have a pretty good sense for what most of you are going to say. Okay, so clearly there is a degree of shared taste for your choice between these two images. However, your preference, or the preference for most of you, for the pretty garden picture on the left, versus the picture of the parking lot on the right, it's hard for us to understand what's driving that preference. And one reason for that is because there are many differences between these two types of images at many different levels of analysis. So for example, there are low-level differences in their visual content. The image on the left has more color, it has higher spatial frequency. The image on the right has much less color contrast, it has much more straight lines. So, you might think that you could determine my preference purely by looking at, for example, a computational model that mimics early vision, right? On the other hand, it's also the case that these two images differ in higher level semantic properties, in what meaning you ascribe to them and what associations you have with them. So for example, you might think that the garden would be lovely to walk through and that it might smell nice and that you might hear nice sounds and it would be calming. Whereas the walking through the parking lot on the right might make you think about traffic and that you're late for work and that maybe you have to pick something up from the store and you have to watch out for a car coming towards you. So there's a lot of difference between these two. And one problem is that often case, these two levels of analyses are not well distinguished from each other. I don't know if I should try to get this. Is this bothering people that that's up there? Or I don't know if it, okay, now it goes away. I don't know what, all right. One problem is that these two levels of analyses are often confounded with each other. So one thing I'm very interested in is trying to understand how much can we attribute people's aesthetic judgments to external objective stimulus features versus internal subjective factors. And there's a whole list of different things that people have looked at in these two different veins. And I've just listed some of them here. For example, many groups have investigated aspects of symmetry or aspect ratio, like the golden ratio, or contrast, complexity, that in some way that you could measure objectively from an image, the presence of specific colors, straight versus curved lines, or the degree of fractal dimension as potential predictors of aesthetic preferences. On the other hand, a variety of groups have also investigated various subjective internal states. How new is it? Which you can only define with respect to a person's previous exposure. What meanings do people associate with it? How fluent is it, which means how easy is it to process? How complex is it subjectively? So one person might find a particular image complex, but another person may not, because perhaps they've spent a lot of time looking at similar types of images and they understand the structure of that domain. What types of emotional responses do you have to these images? How relevant is it to you and your lived experience? So these are all subjective factors that might predict people's aesthetic preferences. So as I mentioned, for many types of experiences, these two levels tend not to be separable. And much of the work in kind of the early days of empirical aesthetics relied on averaging. So you would take a bunch of people, assess their responses to a set of images, and then you would average everyone's response to one image to find out which is the most preferred image and which is the least preferred image. And then that data would form the basis by which you would then decide what's driving people's preferences. And of course, if you're averaging across people, then you're going to get rid of those individual differences and you're going to actually end up emphasizing the objective features and their importance in your analysis. So what we do is, rather than asking which is the most preferred image on average and which is the least preferred image on average, instead, we ask whether or not people like the same images. We assess the degree of agreement across people. So in what circumstances does everyone agree and show the same types of preferences? And under what circumstances do people show vastly idiosyncratic preferences? And is there some law like nature that can help us predict when people will agree and when people will not agree? And what does this tell us about the nature of aesthetic appeal? So the way we do this is by measuring shared taste. And there are a number of outcomes you might expect. One outcome is that everyone agrees, everyone generally has the same set of preferences. Another outcome is that each person is an individual snowflake and that one person is not able to predict another person at all. Of course, there are intermediate outcomes. It might be the case that there are groups or clusters or some perhaps multidimensional space, but perhaps it's not the case that every person's individual. For example, when you look for a movie on Netflix, the recommendations given to you by Netflix are typically created by taking your past preferences and then using other people who are similar to you, not everyone, but other groups who have already given similar ratings to you as a best predictor for you. So they know that people's aesthetic judgments of movies tend to cluster, and that they can better predict people that way. Okay, so in one early experiment, was that a question or no? In one early experiment, using this technique, we showed people a set of real-world scenes, images like this, things like gardens and parking lots and farms. And then in another session, we showed the same observers a set of abstract images like these. And so the reason these images were designed such that they do have variation in low-level image features. There's variation in color, there's variation in shape, there's variation in contour, there's variation in figure ground ordering. However, they don't contain any semantic associations that are culturally shared. So if you were to try to describe the image to the person sitting next to you, you would have to resort to a long list of things. Oh, there's a kind of looks like this, and it goes this way, and it's yellow in here, and you would actually probably end up trying to describe it through what it looks like, some kind of semantic thing that it might look like. You know, oh, maybe it looks kind of like yellow leaves or something like that, right? So these images don't contain culturally shared semantic information. And so what we do is we measure agreement across people, and the data looks like this. I'm going to be showing you a number of plots like this, so I'm going to take a moment to walk you through how to read this type of data. So here in black, or in the dark bars, we see agreement for between pairs of observers for the real world scenes. So if two people gave the exact same set of ratings on this set of 96 images, then that would produce a data point over here at 1. If two people gave exactly opposite ratings, that would give a data point over here at -1. And so what you can see with this histogram is that there's a healthy degree of agreement across pairs of observers for these real world images. In this data set, it averages about 0.5. If I take the exact same people and now show them these abstract images, I get the light gray distribution. And I don't even need statistics to know that these two distributions are different. You see this very large shift towards 0. There is still a degree of preference of agreement on average, but now you even see that there are pairs of observers that are anti-correlated, where one person was almost the opposite of another person in terms of their expressed preferences for which of these abstract images they preferred. So what we take away from this is that it highlights the importance of meaning or semantics for preferences. So when present, semantic associations and culturally shared meaning will have more influence on preferences than lower level stimulus differences. And this does not mean that low level features don't matter. Of course, low level features are the vehicle by which we get to higher order semantic and relational associations. However, I think that this hierarchically structured information tends to carry more weight when it's present in determining people's judgments. And so if two people share high-level interpretation of an image, they're more likely to share an aesthetic judgment of that image. In another domain, actually with color preferences, another group found a very similar thing. And actually, this result has been replicated quite a number of times since this first report. They found with color preferences that actually nothing about the physical wavelength of the color was best predictive. They found that the best predictor of people's color preferences were their stated valence, the valences, the positive and negative associations they had with objects that were those colors. So people like blue because they generally like sky, and people don't like mustardy yellow because it reminds them of human excrement and vomit. And so that was, even for something as simple as color preferences, they actually found that meaning tended to be a stronger predictor for aesthetic judgments. Okay, so shared semantics lead to shared preferences. The Palmer and Schloss one was done in Eastern, some Eastern cultures as well. And in fact, they found that some of the notable differences in color preferences between, for example, Chinese observers and American observers could be predicted by some of the differences in how in cultural associations people had with those colors. So for example, red is associated with weddings and celebrations in China, whereas in the US, the dominant association was blood. Of course, there are others as well, but that actually was one of the bigger differences between the two cultures. My results have been mostly tested in Western observers. I don't know if someone's done a replication in non-Western culture, but I would expect that it generally would replicate. Okay, so are there general principles for when we might expect more or less shared taste? One thing we've done to try to get at this is that we've measured shared taste for multiple visual domains. And in this experiment, we used a set of faces, a set of natural landscapes, two different sets of architecture, interior and exterior, and visual artworks. And before I move on to the next, to the results of that study, I want to mention that in this and most of the studies since then, we have moved away from asking people about pleasure or about beauty, and instead we have tried to find a way to get at the fact, particularly when you're dealing with artwork, that people find people like artwork for many more reasons other than conventional beauty. And in fact, we were worried that many of our participants, if we asked them to rate the beauty, that a modern person's view of beauty is that it is something about, you're asking me to tell you, oh, is it, what do other people think about it, right? And so someone might say, oh yeah, that's a beautiful image, but it doesn't do it for me. I'm not into that. I'm into things that are more like weird or something like that. And so, of course, what we want to know is which images are actually moving, emotionally grabbing for people. And so, for example, challenging performances or sad music or experiences that evoke wonder can all be extremely aesthetically moving and impactful experiences, even though they may not be conventionally pretty. So we have adopted the term being moved as a phrase that we use primarily in our research, and some variations, especially moving to Germany with differences in language. We have tried a few different terms that tap into this. And the idea is that being moved can reflect aesthetic responses that derive from differently valenced or even mixed emotional states. They're associated with art elicited chills. And in our hands, we've used them primarily as a summary measure of diverse aesthetic experiences. Of course, there are groups, for example, the Meninhouse group, that tries to understand the subtle differences between what it would mean to find something beautiful versus being moved, et cetera. And there are some differences, but when we try to then look at brain imaging results, we are using a relatively blunt tool, and so we want to at least move towards an operationalization that captures this important fact about people's experiences with art. Yeah.
That's a clarification question. So among the artworks we included in our experiment, so I gather that you included artworks that display negatives.
I can tell you more about some of those in a moment.
Yeah, but the question is, did you also include artworks that might not be appreciated because of their perceptual properties? That might be appreciated for semantic properties, that it is more difficult to grasp their conceptual properties, like also perceptual art, that kind of stuff.
I think so, definitely. I think quite a number of the artworks that we included are, might have more of a conceptual component to them, for sure. This study, we did not necessarily, we haven't done a study that's specifically focused on conceptual art, and there are some people who have, actually. But that has not been a specific focus. So I don't know that I can answer 100% that I know for a fact that certain people use the conceptual properties when making their judgments. But maybe let's come back to that, okay? Yeah, in general, I think that the answer is yes, would be my guess.
Yeah, well, that's quite a good first word that those words are actually not appreciated in the aesthetic. So for some philosophers, it would be fine.
Say that again.
For quite a bunch of philosophers, certain works of conceptual art are not appreciated as they are object of intellectual. And there's reasons to distinguish that kind of appreciation from aesthetic appreciation.
See, this may be one place where where a typical of a historic or a that definition of aesthetics would differ from mine. Because to me, if a person finds a piece of artwork touching and moving because of its conceptual properties, that is an aesthetic experience. If they go, wow, that's amazing, then that, for me, would also count as a positive aesthetic experience. Okay, okay, so what we generally find, I'm kind of summarizing the results here. What I'm using here is I'm displaying the amount of variance that we can measure in people's responses. And in the dark colors, the amount of variance we can attribute to a shared factor. And therefore, in the light colors, the amount of variance that we can only attribute to individual factors. And this is actually, I've already taken out non-repeatable variance. So if you, when I ask you to rate the same set of images again and give completely different ratings, that is variance I can't even predict. It's purely noise. And so that's already been removed. And so this is showing out of the repeatable variance for artwork and for architecture, somewhere around 10% of the variance can be attributed to a shared factor. On the other hand, we see that it's a bit higher, a fair amount higher for natural kinds, and the exact values do vary depending on experiment to experiment and the exact set of images. But in general, this has also been replicated by other groups now. We see that there's quite a bit of higher degree of shared taste when people are making judgments of natural kinds versus making judgments of artifacts of human culture. And so I want to take a moment to talk about this distinction, because I think that it's quite an important distinction when thinking about the domain of empirical aesthetics. So we find a high degree of shared taste for naturally occurring aesthetic domains and a much lower degree of shared taste for artifacts of human culture. So that means aesthetic judgments are relying on more similar information across people for natural domains, but are relying more on individual aesthetic sensibilities for artifacts. And kind of my working hypothesis, and this really is just a working hypothesis, is that perhaps this is because over a lifetime of experience, our judgments of naturally occurring aesthetic domains have higher behavioral relevance for us. For example, I think we already have some evidence that infants, for example, don't necessarily already have hardwired preferences for faces. There's evidence that there's actually pretty good evidence that now, and I can talk about this later in question period if you like, that, for example, using twin studies, you can show that there's actually quite low heritability for people's shared taste. And so I think that actually it requires learning. It requires learning over someone's lifetime. And so it's about the fact that your judgments with landscapes and with faces have relevance for you. They feed back on your actual decisions. For most of us, however, our judgments of artifacts of human culture don't have consequences. Unless you are an artist or you are an art critic, the fact that you have a particular artistic sensibility isn't going to negatively affect you socially or physically. And so it allows most of us to maintain an individual sensibility for particular styles over the functionality of those objects. Again, it's just a working hypothesis, and I'm happy to be proven wrong. Okay.
So what do you mean by preference for style or functionality? Just
let's say that if perhaps there's a let's take architecture for example. Perhaps I am a big fan of Rococo or a Baroque, and you're a big fan of something else. Whereas an architect might look at the building and be like, that building's about to fall down. Or that building would be a nightmare to actually wire plumbing through, or something like that. And although of course, I think many architects are also thinking more about, of course, how people move through the space, and their definition of function might have to do with what happens in the space, right? And so that is also a definition of function that they might bring to the table that many of us, without that experience, wouldn't even necessarily be aware of. For time, I might skip over this, but I just want to mention that we have looked at some of this same type of technique in other domains like poetry and music. Here's an example of a poetry study where we find that actually the best predictor of aesthetic appeal was actually the degree of mental imagery that people felt that they were getting from individual poems. And again, there was very low agreement across people in terms of which particular poems they found aesthetically pleasing. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to some brain imaging work. And I, as always, see that I've already been talking a very long time. Okay, so This research, there's a number of studies I'm hoping to tell you a bit about, and they really started with this very simple question, not really a philosophical question at all, but whether or not there's a unique brain state associated with an aesthetic experience. I guess it does have philosophical implications, clearly. And so to do so, we did some experiments where we started with a large and diverse set of artwork. It was 109 artworks from approximately the 15th to 21st century, and that spanned both Western and Eastern traditions in a variety of styles and periods, and included some abstract images, some representational, some with people, some more with landscape. So it's a quite diverse set. And the goal here was that without really knowing how much agreement we were going to find across people, this was actually done before the experiment I just told you about, we wanted there to be something for everyone. We didn't know what people were going to like, but we were hoping that you as a participant in the study might find at least a few of the artworks in this set to be aesthetically engaging and aesthetically moving. And the instructions we gave to people emphasize this real subjective sense. So imagine that the images you see are paintings that may be acquired by a museum of fine art. The curator needs to know which paintings are the most aesthetically pleasing based on how strongly you as an individual respond to them. So we want you to give your gut level response based on how much you find the painting beautiful, compelling, or powerful. Note the paintings may span the entire range from beautiful to strange or even ugly. Respond on the basis of how much this image moves you. So some people read these instructions and they see a nightmare because they feel like we've mixed 20 different concepts. But in fact, when we show these instructions to our participants, they come out of that, especially after a few practice draws, like, okay, I get it. You know, that I'm not just supposed to indicate which images are conventionally pretty, but the ones that really grab me, right? So if it grabs me and I'm like, wow, that's amazing, I would really recommend that somebody else see it, or I would want to experience that again, even if it was dark or whatever, then that counts, and that's what I should be indicating. And so we found that these types of instructions actually work quite well for us. Okay, so in terms of the brain imaging results, here I'm just going to briefly summarize one aspect of it here. We find when we compare those images that were rated with the most moving label, this is a 4 on a 4-point scale, versus those images that were rated a 1, the least moving on our 4-point scale, we found 2 different brain systems, at least, but we could roughly group them into 2 systems that were engaged more for highly moving versus low moving images. And one of those systems I've highlighted here in blue are mostly in perceptual regions in the back of the brain, in visual perceptual regions that showed a roughly linear response. So each time you go from one liking level to the next, you see an increase in the amount of activity in these regions. You also see a similar thing in striatal regions, part of the reward system. However, we saw a different set of brain regions in the front of the brain that seemed to show a bit more of a step-like pattern, which meant that images that were rated a 1 versus a 2 versus a 3 didn't really change in their response. It was only those images that were given the highest rating, the 4, they were strongly moving, that seemed to engage these brain regions. And so the fact that we're seeing these 2 different patterns really tells us that we are seeing 2 brain systems, 2 different processes being engaged. One that is kind of responding to every image, and another one that is really only coming online when something is strongly engaging. So we were, of course, very interested in the second pattern, and we looked at the data in a slightly different way to try to better understand what was going on during these highly moving experiences. And what I'm going to show you here is a brain imaging contrast between images that were rated as a 1, the lowest rating, versus just staring at a blank screen. So the first thing you'll notice is that here, this is the lateral side of the brain, like you're looking at me from the side. My eyeballs would be here, my ear would be here. And then this is the same hemisphere, but from the mid-sagittal view, so the interior view of the same left hemisphere. And what you see, first of all, is that there's a lot of visual activity in the back of the brain. This is not at all surprising. The blue is actually showing you parts of the brain that are more active for looking at a blank screen than for looking at an image of art. And that may seem surprising, but anyone who has done some degree of brain imaging would be familiar with this and not surprised. these are a set of regions that are now largely known as the default mode network. They're a set of regions that tend to be more active when a person is thinking internally focused, and they are suppressed. Their activity level goes down when we engage with the external world. And the finding of this set of brain regions, when they were first identified in the late 90s, early 2000s, was kind of a bit of a revolution for cognitive neuroscience. It was a reminder that, of course, the brain is always active. The brain is not a passive responding piece of meat. The brain is predicting and thinking constantly. And of course, there are going to be regions that may become less active when you have to shift your attention to a task. So it fits and it makes sense. And so we see these brain regions are less active when I show you an image. Not surprising. If you look at the twos, the image is rated 2. It's very similar. There's a bit more of the orange and some other orange in other regions, but the blue is still there. Same for the 3s. The blue is still strongly there. There's a bit more orange in a few regions. But then when we go to the 4s, you can see that a lot of this blue disappears, particularly in the medial prefrontal cortex, but also in some of the other regions as well. You get a lot less of the blue. So what that means is that this brain system that is typically suppressed when you engage with the external world is actually getting re-engaged when people are rating these images as highly aesthetically moving. And so here's just a summary of that, and a bar plot showing the signal from this medial prefrontal region. This is an image of the canonical default mode network, and you can see that it's a quite good match in terms of the regions that we're seeing showing this pattern. And so the DMN.
These are just deactivations, right?
So they're deactivations, and what we're seeing is less deactivation. But of course, in a brain imaging context, we're always comparing A against B. So it means that it's a relative, right? So it means that the activity level is coming in these regions back up towards where it was when you were in the inter-trial interval, not engaged in the task at all. And of course, it's not the case that during that period, your brain is not active, but you may be doing other things, like you may be thinking about what you had for breakfast this morning, or what you're going to have for dinner tonight, or what you're going to do next week when you go to a friend's house. So you're thinking about other things, or thinking internally. And so this set of brain regions is highly interconnected. It's typically suppressed during externally focused tasks, and it's activated by self-referential, internally focused mental processing, like autobiographical memory, judgments of self-relevance, and self versus other perspective. So what we think is going on here is that the visual system, and of course I'm talking most about vision, but the same would be true in other sense modalities. The visual system is active when you have external focus. Typically, under normal circumstances, either you have external focus or you have internal focus and you're thinking, and these two brain systems tend to operate in antiphase with each other. So these two networks tend to be opposed. But we think that when people are highly aesthetically moved by artwork, that both external and internal networks are engaged and perhaps talking to each other. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing since then has been trying to better understand this and understand what exactly is going on here. Is it causal, or is it purely a side effect? Can we kind of unpack a bit more what is going on here in these experiments? Okay, I'm going to just briefly mention, without too much detail, an experiment that we did in, in 2019, where we used a similar set of artworks. However, now images were shown for different lengths of time, either 1 second, 5 seconds, or 15 seconds, and we had a delay period. And this allowed us to disentangle some of the neural responses to image onset versus image offset versus making a rating. We could tease these components apart a bit better. And the main result from that study was that we found that DMN, the default mode network signal, tended to lock on to the external dynamics of stimulation only for high preferred trials. And so what you're seeing here is that if you look at these three here, you can see that when the image turns off, these traces are aligned with image turning off. You can see that the curves actually fall down together back to baseline only for the highly moving images. So that means that the DMN was somehow kind of like engaged or following, and then when the image turns off, the DMN also shows a fall off, and those are only time locked for the highly moving images. For the other images, it might be the case that the DMN started doing something else before the end of the trial and was no longer engaged with external stimulation. So we don't necessarily think that DMN being active is a signal for aesthetic appeal. I actually don't think that's the case. I think it's really about the network interactions. It's about how these different networks are talking to each other, and that during these moments of high aesthetic appeal, we're getting some different network interactions happening. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to tell you about another study that we've done, specifically, primarily focused on the default mode network. And this actually harkens back a little bit to the behavioral study I mentioned, where we look across different aesthetic domains. So this study starts from the idea that different domains of aesthetic objects rely on different features for the assessment of their aesthetic appeal. So when you're evaluating a painting, you may be looking at fine brush strokes. When you are looking at an architecture, you may be looking at the shapes of the buildings. Those features are very different from what you might use to analyze a natural landscape and decide if a natural landscape is beautiful. And they also give rise to different levels of agreement, as I showed you before. And so we were interested in understanding whether or not we need multiple aesthetic brain systems, or whether or not one domain general system would be able to deal with all of these different types of visual aesthetic domains. And the approach we took was not, rather than doing an activation study, which I don't have time to go into, but it's actually, I think, is not the right way to assess this. We wanted to use a prediction framework, and I'll explain that here. So we have these three aesthetic domains, which allowed us to compare photographs versus non-photographs, and also artifacts of culture versus natural images. People see the images for 4 seconds in the scanner and make a rating. And then what we do is we play this little game where we take not the activation from a brain region, but the pattern across the individual voxels, so the individual pixels, the points in the brain region. And we assess whether or not that pattern of activity is predictive of people's aesthetic appeal. So what we do is we take a set of trials, we take the pattern of brain activity, for example, when you were looking at art, and then we see, can we train a machine learning classifier, and then can that classifier now predict new held out trials of the same domain of artwork, for example? And so that's what's illustrated here. We can train a machine learning classifier on brain data while you're looking at art and test on art, and do the same for architecture or for landscape. Then the critical comparisons are these, where we train our classifier on trials where the observer was looking at landscapes, for example, and then we test on trials where the person was looking at architecture. And so if that brain region contains information, if that pattern contains information about aesthetic appeal that is domain general, then the classifier should be able to predict people's responses in these across domain comparisons as well. Okay? So here's just a little cartoon of that. Again, we train on one domain and test on another. And so we've got these within domain comparisons on the diagonal and the across domain comparisons on the off diagonal. And the first thing we do is we look inside the DMN nodes. I've illustrated them here, some of the important nodes of the DMN. And what you see is that moving up here is the within domain performance. So training on art, testing on art. And we can see that many of the DMN nodes can predict better than chance people's aesthetic responses. And here we're predicting individual aesthetic responses of individual people. When you take all regions together, the DMN as a whole does even better. And now, interestingly, down here, what you see is when you now look at the across domain performances, these bars are not entirely symmetric, but they're actually quite big. So the DMN regions seem to be predicting almost as well across domain as they are predicting within domain. And this is in contrast to some regions that are part of the higher level regions of the visual pathways. So the ventral visual pathway is a visual pathway in the brain that is supports people's understanding of what they're looking at. Or am I looking at a scene or an object? What kind of object? And these three regions here that I've highlighted are regions that show selectivity for places, objects, and faces. And we see that each of these regions, as well as the entire chunk of cortex here, does contain some information about aesthetic appeal. So that it does better than chance, but only for when you're predicting within domain. So whatever information these higher level visual regions contain about aesthetic appeal, it's domain specific. It's not in a representational space that is kind of generalized away from the features of particular image types.
Just a clarification, it does predict the aesthetic judgment, right? Not just the activity.
Correct. We're predicting high versus low aesthetic appeal. Yeah. So we're not just predicting category, we're predicting the aesthetic response. Yeah. Okay. So in general, we think we find using a strong test, a domain general representation of aesthetic appreciation of the DMN. And so we think the DMN may be part of a core system representing aesthetic appeal. However, we find that higher level visual regions are domain specific. And I didn't show it here, but we also find additional domain specific prefrontal resources that seem to be recruited when people are making judgments of artifacts of human culture. And I don't think that there are, for example, architectural regions of the brain. What I think is that when you have to make judgments about artifacts of human culture, you have to draw on a lot of additional executive functions. You have to draw on a lot of memories, a lot of different ideas, a lot of associations. And so you see more of the prefrontal cortex, some regions of the prefrontal cortex, especially right here in the prefrontal, in the frontal pole, are just required when you have to make these judgments for which you don't have a pre-existing mechanism that has been well tuned by lots of exposure to the category of objects. Okay, so I've already talked for quite a long time. I think what I'll do is I'll get through this study and then I'll stop. Okay, are people generally doing okay? Okay, great. So in this study, I've told you a little bit about the visual system. I've told you about the default mode network. In many of my studies, we also look at the reward system. I haven't spoken about that as much today. It does, of course, overlap with the DMN to some degree. In this study here, we really want to understand how is it that we go from the visual system, from the visual representations, to a measure of aesthetic valuation that might be represented in parts of the brain's reward system. And so we're not really looking at the DMN so much. And you might think about this as trying to understand how the brain goes from a representation of what we see to a representation of what we like. And so this is my attempt to try to go from, rather than just outlining the general nature of a system, I want to better understand this transformation from a visual representation to an affective representation. And I don't really think that there's been a lot of work really thinking about how this is done. And what I'm going to show you today is really just early stages in this. It really is more suggestive than it is conclusive. But I think it's interesting to think about. And okay, in addition, in this study, one other thing that we've done and that I've been doing in my lab is moving from static experiences of unchanging artworks to dynamic measures of changing experiences. And one reason for this is that in a brain imaging context, if we have a signal in a visual region, for example, that fluctuates over time because the experience that you're looking at, the visual stimulus is changing over time, then we can use that as a signature and we can track that changing signal over time and look for other parts of the brain that are kind of locked to that signal. So that was one reason that motivated us to actually start moving to more dynamic experiences. And of course, you know, the earlier experiment I mentioned where we were looking at artworks for different periods of time was also motivated by the idea that even with a static artwork, our experience is not static. We may notice one part of the artwork first and focus on it, and then we may notice something else and shift, and then we may take a step back, and then we have an overall kind of judgment, and maybe at some point we go like, oh wow, that's really cool, or at some point we're like, I don't know about that. You know, so clearly our experience evolves over time, and we want to start developing dynamic measures of these experiences. I would say that we're still in somewhat early phases of this. So we want to understand how the brain extracts aesthetic appeal during dynamically changing visual experiences. So my postdoc Ilkay Izik for a project where we assess dynamics using video. And so a person might watch a video like this of a person moving through a landscape, and they make a continuous rating using a little dial telling us how much are you enjoying the clip at each moment. And then when the clip is over, we also ask them for an overall judgment. In this case, we asked them how intense was your aesthetic experience overall. This was in German, the phrasing of this question. And in speaking with people in our institute, they felt that this was a good way in German to capture this overall aesthetic experience. Okay. And then here, what I'm showing is some of the results that we get. So for example, if we look at one person rating many different clips, we find that this person generally liked some of the clips and kind of got more positive over time. Others they tended to not like. There are some clips where they went up and then down and did show some dynamics throughout the clip. On the other hand, if we look at many people rating a single clip, we again see that there's quite a bit of variation. Some people like this particular clip, some people really don't. Some people go to a pole of response and kind of stay there. Other people do actually show some degree of variation over time, responding more or less to certain moments in the clip. So again, there's a lot of variation from person to person. And when we look at this variation, so this is just one measure of variation here, we first of all find that in general, even the person who's moving the least is moving more than if they were just kind of monotonically increasing towards a final point. So they are showing some degree of variability here, but it's quite different from person to person. And when we look at the how much variation there is that we can attribute either to particular clips or to particular people, we find that much more variability in responding can be attributed to particular people. So what does this mean? This means that if you're a person who moves a lot, you tend to do that to all the different clips. You tend to be very responsive, and other people just don't really move very fast. So we kind of colloquially call these people fast responders versus integrators. And again, whether or not that's actually what people are doing, we don't know. But kind of our intuition is that some people, they need a bit more time to really integrate it into a response where then they feel that they can respond with the dial, whereas other people are really trying to clue in more to these faster fluctuations and are able to do so. Okay, when we look at the brain imaging results, here we look in a number of brain regions, including DMN regions as well as reward regions and visual regions. And what you can see here is that in comparison to looking at nothing, a blank screen, this is showing the set of brain regions that are more active for these clips, regardless of their aesthetic appeal. And so we see a number of brain regions that are active, and importantly, in comparison to static images, we see that motion parts of the brain, motion responsive parts of the brain are engaged, as well as a few regions that are more on the dorsal side of the ventral of the visual pathways. And this is important because clearly when you move from still images to moving images, you expect to engage more of the brain. And in particular, we engage visual pathways that are known to support interaction with visual scenes. So brain regions that represent how we might move through a scene or how we might interact with objects. So we're getting engagement of not just this what pathway describing what we're looking at, but a larger portion of the visual brain. However, when we can now look in these regions, and so we have a region that, for example, we independently localize that we know responds to motion. And we have another region that we know responds to the shape of the scene, and another region that we know is responding to object properties. When we look in these regions, we actually find that these regions themselves are not significantly modulated by aesthetic appeal. And so down here, you can see, for example, in the motion region, there's no, the bars are a little bit different, but there's no significant difference. There's no trend here, but this is really kind of like increasing steadily across. And the same for PPA, it's almost flat. So we found that these regions actually themselves are not responding to high versus low aesthetic appeal differentially. It was actually surprising to us. We thought that they would, and in fact, they don't. Or if they do, it's only very weak. It's not. It's definitely not anything very strong. And so, okay. Oops. Okay. So video engages more of the cortex, and these brain regions that represent visual features do not also carry information about appeal. Rather, when we use a different analysis and look across the entire brain, we find that there are regions that are responding more for highly moving versus low moving images, but they tend to lie just outside of or right on the edge of these regions that we can define that respond to specific visual features. So for example, here is human MT, and then these red splotches are shown where we see high versus low aesthetic appeal responses. Or here is PPA, and we can see here, you can see it good on the right here, it kind of sits right on the edge. Here in the left hemisphere, they look like they overlap more, but when we look at individual observers, we see that they actually don't overlap more. The overlap that you're seeing here on the surface is actually an artifact of the fact that you're averaging across people before you are projecting the results onto the surface. So this tells us that, I mean, if we're seeing that, it's really telling me that they really are like right next to each other. It's right on the edge, but the PPA conventionally defined is not really showing a strong response, a strong difference. So what does this mean that the regions themselves are not responding to aesthetic appeal, but rather kind of neighboring regions or regions that are right on the edge are showing some degree of aesthetic modulation? And what I think is going on is that we're trying to think about this more from the perspective of predictive coding and predictive mechanisms, that you have a vast amount of experience in your lifetime with what images and scenes should look like. And sometimes certain features of those scenes are unique, or they're slightly different, or a little bit out of the norm, out of the ordinary. And those may generate surprise. And it may not be a strong surprise signal, maybe like, oh, cool, wow, those clouds are doing something a little different than I've seen before. Or, oh, wow, that the colors on that hillside are changing and different from kind of my model of what they should look like, even if it's because of the changing of the seasons. And so your more recent experience is expecting green, but now you're starting to see bits of yellow, right? So these are kind of these small local surprise signals, or uniqueness or different signals. And I think that this is really what the brain is doing in these regions here, that it's got a predictive model for what the world is going to look like. And when it sees divergences from this, when it sees a surprise signal, a prediction error, that is computed locally in many different parts of the brain for all different types of signals, for motion, for shape, for scene, for all of these things. And then these different signals form an elemental affect signal, a small, local, early signal that something is out there is different, something out there is surprising, something out there is unique. And then perhaps these elemental affect signals can then be summed together by some other brain system to actually give a more specific and explicit representation of an affective response. And I'll come back to this, but in this study, we actually don't see any clear DMN modulation. Okay, so I've got just 2 slides to kind of wrap this up and hopefully generate some discussion. So hopefully I presented you with some what I think is good evidence for the interactionist view of aesthetic appeal. So we have a stimulus and we have an observer, and I think that you can't really find an aesthetic experience in either one of them solely, that you really are having to look at the interaction between them. And in particular, I think that aesthetic appeal emerges from the interaction of the stimulus and experience with an observer's mind. And that includes their knowledge, their past experiences, their beliefs, their predictions, and that aesthetic appeal is really signaling that something out there in the world is different, is unique, and that it really, that this is one of the primary bases for aesthetic appeal. It may not be the only one. This is, I think, kind of the stimulus-driven bottom-up part of aesthetic appeal. And the putative mechanism, as I mentioned, is, I think that in the first step that there's basically a prediction error or surprise, there's a detection of something unique about a stimulus. Either it diverges from expectations, it activates unexpected associations. There are many different forms of kind of surprise that might fit the bill. And then the second step is that there's uncertainty reduction, when you actually have that kind of aha, when you understand something and you get pleasure from that understanding, from that reduction of uncertainty about the visual world. or about the world in general. And so if I think about how I would try to construct a model of this, rather than weighing individual features, taking a map of visual features and weighing some visual features, rather, I'm interested in looking at models where instead we might take a weighted sum over local uncertainty reduction signals. And so what do I mean by that? Well, if I don't predict something about a very low level feature, maybe that doesn't matter very much. Oh, okay, the thing was here, not here, or it's a slightly different color than I expected. But if I have a mismatch, a unique signal, a surprise at a high level of kind of like in the visual hierarchy, for example, at a semantic level or at a level of personal relevance, for example, oh wow, that person I thought they were a stranger, but they're actually someone I know. Right? That is a mismatch at an extremely high level of information. That really matters a lot, okay? And then the last thing I'll mention, something about bottom-up and top-down contributions. So as I showed you here, the DMN does not seem to be engaged as much by the landscapes. And I think that actually landscapes may rely more on these local computations between ongoing stimulation and well-formed representations. You might think of this as bottom-up, but it's not just bottom-up because clearly your predictions involve some degree of top-down or local computation, but it's happening kind of in a way that is tied to the bottom-up stimulation. On the other hand, art may rely more on top-down processes. And in particular, I'm not going to go into this today, I think that assessments of self-relevance are very important, and that resolution of ambiguity is very important. So when you don't really know what it is out there, or when you think something is a piece of art and therefore perhaps a communicative object, and you start thinking about the intentions of the person who created it and what it might mean and what it might mean for you, that starts bringing in all of these other brain processes in addition to these more local processes. And I don't have time to talk about it today, but we've started to kind of try to unpack that and think about how we can knit these two stories together. So with that, I'm going to zoom through this last section, sorry, and get to just my, there we go, my thank you slide. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.